All right. Well, thank you for everybody for joining the 2018 hurricane season outlook. We got off to an early start already with a tropical storm moving through the Gulf Coast, and at least this one was a rainmaker. Not so much a wind maker, but it disrupted some Memorial Day plans in the southeast. And could that be a sign of things to come this hurricane season? It will be quite interesting to see. I want to bring in our experts here. We've got Steve Strum. How are you,
Hey,
Steve?
everybody. Good.
Steve's in Tulsa, Oklahoma. He is our expert on long-range forecasting. We have Eric Faulkner in Charleston, South Carolina. How are you doing, Eric?
Good.
Eric oversees our long-range forecasting business and is one of the most recent members to WDT. We're happy to have you on the team. And we've got Mr. Marine himself, Mike Arellano, down in Houston, Texas. Every ship captain in the world knows Mike, and has worked with a lot of businesses on getting them hurricane prepared. So my name is Rennie Vandeweg, Senior Vice President here at WDT, and we're happy to have you with us today. So we're going to kick things off to get started to talk about what we expect to happen this hurricane season. As I mentioned, it's already been kind of an early start, an active start this season. As we go forward, we're expecting an interesting season, and I'll go ahead and turn it over to Steve right now to give his exclusive forecast on what we expect to happen this summer and into the fall.
Sure. So, again, we have had the sort of early start this year. We had Alberto here this last week, and while it is before the start of the hurricane season, it's only a few days before the start of the hurricane season. And I think I counted 7 of the past 11 years since 2007 where we've had a storm develop prior to the start of the hurricane season. So it's not really that unusual for that to happen, and it's happened quite. I think this is actually the 4th straight year that's happened too. So certainly, when we're this close to June 1st, it's not really that unusual, especially. But one thing that was a little bit different was that Alberto was a subtropical storm, not a pure tropical storm. And so I wanted to have a slide here just to kind of go over that difference between, what's a non-tropical, what's a tropical, what's a, subtropical storm. And the main thing with a subtropical storm is that it's kind of a hybrid between a non-tropical and a tropical storm. The bottom satellite images there show a classic non-tropical storm on the left, a hurricane on the right, a pure tropical system. And in between is actually an image of Alberto from last week, or this past weekend at least. And, kind of shows that it looks kind of, in between the two of those, and that's pretty much the case. So the main difference is that with a subtropical storm, you typically have thunderstorms near the center, but not surrounding the center like you do in a hurricane or a tropical storm. You typically still have dry air kind of spiraling around the center of the storm on one side. Typically, the strongest winds are not located right near the core of the storm, but farther away, kind of like you would see in a non-tropical storm. And a lot of times you'll have an upper level low associated with them. So the atmosphere isn't really quite in a pure tropical mode with them. But typically, if you have a subtropical storm like Alberto, and it sits over warm tropical water for several days, it will eventually become a tropical storm most of the time. So had Alberto not been, running into land, it was kind of contained obviously by the Gulf of Mexico. Had that been somewhere farther, southeast in the Atlantic, say east of the Bahamas, where it had more room and it could stay over water for a longer period of time, it probably would have eventually transitioned into a pure tropical storm. But as it is, it did stay subtropical prior to moving inland, during the last few days. And so certainly, a big rainmaker, but not really a very strong storm in terms of winds. And that's pretty much the case for most early season storms. The ocean temperatures are not quite at the level that we see later in the hurricane season. So if you look at last year here, to recap, again, a very active year. We had 17 named storms, 10 hurricanes, 6 major hurricanes. Really, though, what was different, we've had a lot of very active years in the last decade. Many years that had 5, 6 major hurricanes, a lot of major storms in the basin, but they just hadn't hit the U.S. In fact, since 2005, when we had Hurricane Wilma make landfall in South Florida, we had not seen a major hurricane make landfall anywhere on the U.S. coast. And then last year we had 2 make landfall, Harvey and Irma, on the mainland U.S. Plus we had Maria devastate Puerto Rico, so U.S. territory there. And so 3 major storms impacting, the U.S. areas last year. So certainly a big change compared to previous years, just because we had the storms actually hit the U.S. So that was really the main difference. And now, if you look historically here, this is a plot showing the number of tropical storms in green, hurricanes in kind of a yellow-orange color there, and major hurricanes in red. You can see certainly there's been years in the last decade or so that have had as many or more both storms and hurricanes compared to 2017. But again, the main difference was that the storms just happened to hit the U.S. last year and had meaningful impact, whereas in a lot of those previous years, there wasn't as many actual U.S. landfalls, and certainly no major hurricanes making landfall, in that period of 2006 to 2016. So that was really where the difference was with last hurricane season. Now, this plot here kind of gives you an idea of the areas that are typically most at risk for hurricanes in a given year. This shows every single hurricane landfall since 1950. And the yellow dots are the category 1s up to the red, or the black and red dots for categories 4 and 5 storms. And you can kind of see, in general, the areas most at risk tend to be the central Gulf Coast between Houston and Mobile Bay. South Florida, just because it sticks out there and gets hit from both the Gulf side and the Atlantic side, sees a lot of activity. And again, the Carolinas see a lot of activity, especially from the northern part of South Carolina up to Cape Hatteras, just by a function of the shape of the coastline. The storms that are moving northward kind of just run into those areas. At the same time, because they hit North Carolina a lot of times, it's very rare to get a landfall anywhere north of there. And so we do occasionally see landfalls up towards New York City and Cape Cod and up in eastern Maine, but certainly not nearly as often as farther south towards Cape Hatteras, which tends to kind of collect a lot of the storms that are moving northward. And so you don't see as many direct landfalls farther north. Typically, they kind of stay just off the coast, but occasionally we do see a landfall. However, this does just show hurricane landfall locations. And so a lot of times you'll have a storm that goes up the East Coast and may produce hurricane force winds across, a large section of the coastline, but does not necessarily, make landfall across a lot of those areas. You may just see kind of a long brush of the coast, and that happens fairly often. And so a lot of these areas see hurricane impacts fairly often, but not actual hurricane landfalls, at that point that often. This map here shows pretty much the same thing, but just the number of hurricane strikes by county. Again, South Florida really being the key area there, as well as eastern North Carolina and kind of the Houston and Mobile Bay area being the primary focal areas for hurricane strikes in most years. Again, mostly because of the shape of the coastlines and the prevailing direction with which storms move. So if you look at the time of year where we typically see most of our activity, again, we're right here, right at the cusp of the hurricane season, about to start, that June 1st, mark of the season. But really, you can see everything is usually pretty quiet until we get to August. By August and September, the water temperatures have really warmed up a lot. Our shear levels have gone down considerably in most of the tropical Atlantic basin. We see more tropical waves coming off Africa by August. There's typically less dry Saharan dust around. And so for the most part, the conditions are more favorable by August and September. And so during June and July, even though we are in the hurricane season, typically, on average, we'll see a storm every 3 weeks, maybe every 2 weeks during a more active year. But typically, we don't really get going where we see storms every week or more until we hit August and September and October. And so we are still a couple of months away from that really key time of the season. And that's typically when most of the major hurricanes happen as well, is during that time period of August and September, which is just because that's when we have the warmest water temperatures, the most fuel for those storms to get going. So now let's look here at what typically we see during the years that have a lot of hurricane activity. The plot on the left-hand side there kind of is a subtraction of the years that were very active minus the years that were not very active. And so it kind of shows that typically we see cooler than normal water across the Pacific Ocean, generally that La Nina pattern in place across the Pacific Basin, whereas in the Atlantic, we see a lot of those areas warmer than normal in the tropical areas. And last year we had that sort of regime by the middle of the hurricane season, at least to some extent. The map on the right shows what we have this year. We're kind of in the neutral ENSO range. We kind of had the La Nina this past winter. That's faded away. We may be going towards an El Nino here during the latter part of this year, but we're not there right now. And the Atlantic basin is much cooler, and the tropical area is actually below normal now in many areas off the coast of Africa, westward into parts of the Caribbean. So we're not nearly as warm as we were last year in those areas. And both of those factors are going to likely suppress activity a little bit from what we saw during last season. If you look closer in here, this is a map showing SST anomalies for the last 2 months on the left, as well as surface pressure anomalies, and those are tied together. The reason we have the cool water is that red bullseye on the map on the right-hand side shows where we've had stronger than normal air pressure over the Atlantic basin, so a stronger than average Bermuda high. What that has done is basically pulled more, or we've had a stronger circulation around that high, and so that's drawn more cooler water down the west coast of Africa, and in turn cooling the water there in that area. Plus, it's also helped to produce more evaporation because we've had stronger winds, so you evaporate more seawater. That also cools the water temperature. Plus, it helps drive a little bit more upwelling along the coast of Africa, bringing up more cooler water from the subsurface areas, and also, again, cooling the surface waters. And so this whole process has basically produced a lot of cool water in the tropics, but at the same time, it's driven more warm water northeastward into the central Atlantic. And so that's kind of the regime that we've seen thus far. And so if that does continue through a large part of the hurricane season, that is going to have some impact on reducing overall levels of activity, especially across the tropical Atlantic, likely kind of delaying development there and reducing intensity of storms that are in that part of the basin. However, again, the Gulf of Mexico is warmer than average, at least in the central areas, and a lot of the Atlantic, closer to the U.S., is also warmer than average. So certainly, it's not going to have an impact on storms that are close to the U.S. So we'll have to watch that closely as well. Now, again, comparing to last year on the upper right, we had that warmer than normal water across the tropical Atlantic. This year, again, it's cooler than normal across most of those areas. Now, the bottom right-hand map there shows a model forecast for this hurricane season, at least for August through October. And this ECMWF model is showing those areas to average a little bit below normal throughout the core of the hurricane season. So if that does in fact happen, again, that will likely reduce overall activity levels below what we've seen during the last year. Also in the Pacific, we are watching a lot of warm water in the subsurface areas of the Pacific that may help to produce an El Nino pattern in the surface waters as we head towards the hurricane season. It's not happening right now, but that is something to watch going forward here. So if we do see an El Nino kind of develop and take shape as we head towards September and October during the heart of the hurricane season, that too could suppress activity levels below what we saw last year. Here are some climate models forecasting El Nino conditions developing gradually as we progress through the balance of the year. Most of the models don't really kind of cross that threshold of El Nino, though, until they get towards, September, October, or, some models are as early as August, others not until October. And so we're kind of looking at maybe about the middle of the hurricane season. So the early part of the season won't really see any El Nino impacts. Obviously, we don't have that in place right now, and we're already to June 1st, just about. But again, El Nino could potentially develop later this year, and it could potentially impact the back half of the hurricane season. And so if that does happen, the main impact would likely be a quieter than average, late September, October, November period. It may have very little impact on the season until then, though. So we could see still an active August and first half of September, but then possibly things may quiet down faster than usual during the back half of the season if that does happen. Now, comparing different types of El Nino years and La Nina years, this table here kind of shows the average number of named storms and hurricanes and major hurricanes for these different types of ENSO patterns. So for all El Nino years since '95, we've only averaged 11 named storms, but for neutral ENSO years, we've averaged 16. So right now we are in a neutral ENSO pattern, but again, we could be transitioning to an El Nino by the back half of the hurricane season, but probably just a weak one. And so we're not likely going to be as quiet as we would see during those composites that would show 11 named storms and 5 hurricanes. So we'll probably be more active than that. But again, if we do see the El Nino form, that likely will keep us a little bit below those averages for a neutral ENSO year of 16 named storms and 8 hurricanes. So in between there is likely where we will end up most likely for this season. And so our official forecast is for 13 to 15 named storms compared to 17 last year, 6 to 8 hurricanes versus 10 last year, and 3 to 4 major hurricanes versus 6 that we saw last year. So again, it's actually a little bit above the long-term average in terms of activity, but below the levels that we saw last year. However, again, it only takes one major hurricane to have a meaningful impact on the hurricane season for the U.S. Obviously, a Category 4 hurricane hitting a major city, makes the whole season a pretty eventful season, regardless of whether we see 5 storms or 15. So that's obviously a key point to kind of drive home. Also, there's not really a big impact, between ENSO phases and the number of hurricanes that make landfall along the U.S. So while we do see a slight increase in the probability of a landfalling storm when we have a La Nina versus an El Nino, there really isn't that much of a difference. And so most years tend to average about 1 landfalling hurricane, regardless of ENSO phase. And so again, odds still favor the U.S. coastline at some point during the season seeing an actual landfalling hurricane, and whether or not it hits a major city or hits a low population area is something that we really can't predict with a high degree of probability. There is a slightly above average probability this year that we could see, or for there to be more activity in the Gulf than average. However, we don't have any real confidence whether or not a place like Houston or New Orleans would see a meaningful impact this year versus South Texas or the middle coast of Western Florida. So we can't really pinpoint exactly where we might see a storm this year, but there is an above average probability for really the entire coastline, but also for the Gulf this year for seeing a landfalling hurricane. So we'll have to watch that. Again, with the Gulf of Mexico warmer than average and the Western Atlantic warmer than average, any storm that does near the U.S. will have more fuel to kind of work with. And so there's still the potential to see a strong storm this year, even if it is a little bit quieter than average or a little bit quieter than the last couple of years that we've seen in terms of the total number of storms in the basin. So certainly, still a very, potentially meaningful season the way it's shaping up, but again, not as extreme as what we saw last year. That pretty much wraps up the forecasting side of things. So Rennie, you can move us on to what we can do with this information to help protect us during the hurricane season.
Sure. I know we had a couple of questions. I'll let Eric ask a couple of the questions that have come in and about this hurricane forecast.
Yes, Steve,
Sure.
you had mentioned El Nino, and depending on the onset and depending on the strength, it could have, impacts to this tropical season. Can you explain a little bit why, El Nino would inhibit storm formation?
So there's a lot of complex things that happen with an El Nino versus a La Nina. I mean, everything from impacting where tropical convection develops in the Pacific and how, to global angular momentum and everything else, that all sort of has impacts on where the storms develop. But in general, when you have an El Nino, we tend to see a shift in where convection happens in the Pacific Ocean, which in turn tends to impact the upper level wind patterns there. And that in turn has a downstream impact on wind shear in the Atlantic basin. So typically when we have an El Nino that gets going in the Pacific, we tend to see a corresponding increase in wind shear across the Atlantic basin, which is really what inhibits a lot of the storm development and also tends to inhibit the overall strength of storms typically during, on average during the hurricane season. But typically, even with an El Nino, you do still see periods of low shear where you can see a strong storm. But on average, you tend to see an increase in wind shear. And that's really the main impact that kind of suppresses overall activity levels versus, say, a La Nina year like we had last year.
Yeah, and I have one more question here. It might be a little bit more difficult, but can you say with any certainty, based on sea surface temperatures or anticipated steering patterns of storms, if we can expect more or less activity in the Gulf or even along the U.S. coast?
So if we do see this Bermuda high stay stronger and kind of situated where it's been, and we see the tropical Atlantic stay cooler than normal, typically what you see happen is the tropical waves don't really develop very far east in the Atlantic. They tend to stay weaker, and that has the overall effect of them kind of not being influenced by the upper level winds as much in terms of the steering currents. And so they kind of tend to just kind of buzz straight westward. And then they can kind of develop once they get closer towards the Caribbean or in the Caribbean or just north of there. And so you can see a regime where you tend to see more of the storms develop closer to the U.S. versus out in the middle of the Atlantic Ocean. And so obviously, if the storms kind of first get going closer to the U.S., it does in general increase the threat level for having a landfalling impact, just because the storms that develop farther east in the Atlantic have the opportunity to get picked up and pulled northward by typically you have like a central Atlantic type trough that is there a lot of the time, and that can pull those storms northward into the Atlantic where they don't ever reach the U.S. coast or get anywhere near the U.S. coast. And so if we do see the current pattern kind of persist, that would increase the probability of more of those storms making it farther west, which by default would give you higher odds for most of the coastline to see a tropical impact during the hurricane season. Again, that may shift a little bit by the time we get going into the heart of the season in September, but there is probably a little bit of an elevated risk because of that this year. And again, the water is warmer than normal near the U.S. coastline too, so we could see a lot of storms like kind of Alberta where they actually form right in the Gulf or say just east of Florida this year or something like that in the Bahamas, where that water is warm this year.
Great, thanks, Steve.
Awesome, guys. Well, we'll need to keep our guard up this year, no doubt about it. The signs are there for them. another active year, maybe not quite as active as last year, but you mentioned, I always think back to Hurricane Andrew, where you had a quiet year, so to speak. And it just, all it took was one. It was the A storm in August, late August. And
right. Yeah, we only had like 4 storms that year, 5, whatever it was, but one was one of the only 2 Category 5s ever hit the U.S. So, and it happened in an extremely quiet year. So again, you can't really look at how active or quiet a year is and decide that that's going to really influence your risk probability just based on that alone.
Absolutely. So I want to go ahead and bring in Mike Arellano into the podcast. Mike's been sitting here quietly and patiently, which is rare for him. Just kidding. Mike is a veteran in the weather industry and has worked, primarily in marine meteorology, working with a lot of customers on tropical type risks and how to mitigate them. And so, Mike, we think back to 2017 last year. What a year. It was impactful for so many people in the Atlantic and in the Gulf of Mexico, and our WeatherOps team was quite busy last year.
Yeah, Rennie was very busy last year, just not only for what we call the ordinary tropical activity, but the extraordinary activity, which was Harvey. So last year was truly one of the biggest years in terms of responding to clients' needs, supporting their activities, and helping them make their decisions. Wanted to share here kind of a slide that shows some stats of exactly what our team does and what we provide and the sheer numbers and how we provide it. And just by the numbers type of report, we issued 548 tropical storm advisories just last year. So that's from start of the storm until the end of the storm. And for the entire season, 548 advisories. That's a lot of advisories. Typically, we were 50 hours earlier than the NHC in terms of starting to release our information. One of the things that we introduced, I think it was last year, was this new product called Significant Tropical Disturbance Advisory. And what we're doing there is we're actually issuing advisories on a system that the National Hurricane Center may not have designated as a named system or is even issuing advisories. And the reason we do that is a lot of our clients, a lot of businesses have long lead preparation times. So they need to start initiating their responses well in advance, and it may be too late to do it once the system is actually named and advisories are start rolling. So when we see a disturbance and we determine it's got a 40% chance or better of developing into a named system, we'll pull the trigger, so to speak, and start issuing advisories on that disturbance. So that just provides our clients with some extra lead time in terms of their plan response. And then finally, we also keep track of our actual forecast versus the Hurricane Center forecast. And just as a disclaimer, we all use the global models as our basis for determining, where a storm's going to go. So it's, nothing too magical, but our meteorologists add their expertise to that final determination. And we do have some in-house models that we use to help us with that. And then last year, for example, we were actually, our distance was only 8 miles off from the 72-hour forecast for that final land location. So we're kind of proud of that fact that our forecasts were very close to what actually occurred. And again, that's a combination of experience and the technology and resources that we have for our WeatherOps team.
Yeah, that's awesome. They really had a good year, ramped things up, and the good news is we go into another active season, one that could bring threat to the Gulf and other land locations here in the United States or those out at sea. We have quite a bit of products available. And so, Mike, I know that you wanted to chat a little bit about some of those products that we can provide to customers to help them prepare, mitigate, and get that early jump start on being prepared for a potential threat.
Right. So Rennie, it's not just the products. Then there's also the personal side. The meteorologists are available. We're a 24-hour, 7-day-a-week operation. So the meteorologists are always there, available for consultation and for conference calls. I know in the Gulf of Mexico, for example, a lot of the businesses that we support, in addition to receiving our written reports, they need that extra live person to speak with to kind of walk them through the information, to kind of confirm what we're thinking. So we do provide a lot of video calls and conference calls just for that purpose. It makes a big deal if you've got to move a vessel, if you have to relocate it to get out of a storm path versus if you don't have to move it. Or, for example, if there's a storm coming up through the Caribbean and the chances are very good that it's going to go toward the Eastern Gulf, maybe toward Florida, then it makes a world of difference if you know you can do minimal response for a platform offshore versus doing the maximum response. So every little bit helps, and that's where we fill in or we bridge that gap when we bring the meteorologist in one-on-one with our clients. And then just to kind of recap for those people out there that are familiar with our services, and for those that aren't, we do provide daily, I call them intel briefings, but it's a daily briefing of what's going on in the tropics each morning. If there's any activity out there to be worried about, and if there is, what it's doing, and what the chances of it developing and threatening a particular area. And then when there is active weather, of course, we follow that up with our advisories, both the tropical disturbance advisories and the active storm advisories. And then we can take that information and drill down even further and make it customized for a particular asset or location. And with that information, we can provide reports such as tea time reports based on a preparation time to shut down operations, a threat report, which would provide you information of when particular intensity winds could arrive at a location, what the amount of rainfall is expected, what the storm surge is, and then also what we call risk and response reports, which is along the lines of a threat report, but then we can take a company's action plan and kind of incorporate it into the threat report to give you guidance on when you need to make certain decisions at implementing your plan based on a certain storm threshold or a certain change in the forecast. So all these are available to our clients out there. Again, a combination of technology and then the experience with the meteorologists. I think we do a good job at providing the information to our clients so they can plan accordingly for the hurricane season.
Absolutely. Well, that brings us to the end of our webinar here. I want to thank everybody for joining us. There are multiple ways you can get a hold of us. We would love to help you out this tropical season. We know that it could be an active one. We want to make sure that you have all the information you need to make very critical decisions. Our team has years and years of experience handling weather and weather threats and how to mitigate your risk with those weather threats. See the email marketing@wdtinc.com. You can visit our website anytime, wdtinc.com, and we'll be happy to get in touch with you, talk about your specific threats, and go through them with you so that you can be prepared as we head through. Looks like I just had a question come through. Are the slides available for download? I'm not sure about the individual slides, but we will have a recording of this webinar available so that you can go through it again. We'll have that ready probably within a day or two, and that may come on with some other information as well when we send out that email after this webinar. So yes, we will make this available to you guys so that you can watch the video and see the information again and review it. But again, Steve, Eric, Mike, thank you so much for being with us today. Your information is invaluable, and while we hope it isn't an active season, should it be, we're here to help you guys out. So thanks again for joining our webinar today, and we look forward to chatting with you soon. Thank you.